All right, welcome to our Provider Enrollment Ownership Reporting webinar. Again, my name is Leanne Foster, and I am a Provider Outreach and Education Specialist here at WPS Government Health Administrators, and I'd like to welcome you again and thank you for taking the time to join us today. I do have to cover our disclaimer. So today's material was created and questions will be answered based on current CMS regulations and guidelines. As you know, Medicare does change often, so make sure that you are monitoring official CMS communications, which includes the CMS website, their manuals, the WPS GHA website, to ensure that you're following the most up-to-date CMS rules and regulations. Photographing, screenshotting, or recording of this education for profit-making purposes is prohibited by CMS. As I mentioned moments ago, I am recording this session, so you will not need to record your own copy of that. By recording this session, what we are going to do, barring any technical issues with recording post this session, we will be posting that to our YouTube channel, and a link to that YouTube channel has been placed in the chat for you. So with that, this is going to allow you to watch this session again if there's something you missed, something you want to see again, or if you know of someone that might find this education useful, maybe didn't have the chance to attend. That will be available. It'll take just a little bit of time. It won't be immediately available, but within the next week or so, you'll see an announcement in our e-news that that encore is available for you. And if you've signed up for alerts on our YouTube channel, you'll see that as well. So our agenda for today. Ownership reporting is a critical part of the provider enrollment process, and it's actually one of the methods used to help prevent fraud in the Medicare program. So what we're trying to do here is prevent those that would do harm to the Medicare program from having access or control over Medicare funds in the first place. It also continues to be one of the top development reasons when we are processing CMS 855 applications. And that can be initial enrollment applications, even change applications. This is really critical information to what we do in the enrollment data that we establish in our provider enrollment chain and ownership system, also known as PACOS. So today we're going to spend time on who needs to be reported or what needs to be reported for ownership, because we're talking about individuals and organizations, so we'll spend some time on that. We're going to talk about how roles play into ownership and managing control reporting and how to report those roles appropriately. Incorrect roles is also one of our top development reasons, one of the things we typically have to clarify when processing an enrollment application. We're also going to spend some time on how to report authorized and delegated officials, including who qualifies to do that. Now, authorized and delegated officials are the individuals that are allowed to sign for CMS 855 applications. They are including initials, changes, if you're a group organization, reassignments that are coming in. They're also the individuals that are being held accountable for the organization. So we'll talk about that. We will also take some time to look at a few examples of different ownership structures. Ownership structures can range from simple to complex. And so we're just going to give you a couple of examples of what those look like, and we'll talk about both indirect and direct ownership examples. To start, we're going to talk about direct owners. So we're talking about who needs to be reported. And again, these are going to be reported on the CMS 855 applications. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to report those a little later on. But we need to have all direct owners of any organization reported on the CMS 855. This is going to be direct owners of the enrolling provider. So when you're filling out your CMS 855 application, it's the provider that the PTAN, or the Provider Transaction Access Number, is being reported for. So Section 2 is who you're looking for, or the owners that you're looking for is of the entity in Section 4. Now this can be individuals. We can have an organization that has one owner or 100 owners, but actual people who have an ownership interest in that entity. They need to be reported in Section 6 of the CMS 855, and that's whether it's a CMS 855B or an 855A. Notice I'm not mentioning the CMS 855I here, because typically with the CMS 855I, we're talking about individuals that are in private practice and they themselves are going to be the only owner and would not have information regarding direct owners in Section 6. This can also mean, though, that an entity has a organization that is a direct owner. So think of parent companies, medical management companies that might have some type of ownership in the enrolling provider in Section 2 of the same CMS 855. If you have to report multiple, it is going to be an instance where you would need to complete the section multiple times. And again, we'll talk about those sections. But whether you're talking about the 855A or the 855B, we are talking about sections 6 for any individual human people owners, or section 5 for any entities that have ownership in the enrolling provider. Next, we're going to get into indirect owners. So indirect owners gets a little bit more murky. It gets a little bit confusing. So at this point, we are looking for entities or individuals that have ownership in an entity listed in Section 5 that has ownership of the enrolling provider in Section 2. So if you have a parent company, if you have, and again, we'll look at examples of this. If you have a parent company that has ownership, the owners of that parent company also need to be reported because they will have what is considered indirect ownership of that enrolling provider. When you have an indirect ownership situation, again, it's typically because you have an entity that was reported in 5, and now we're reporting that entity's owners in Section 6. We are going to need a copy of an organizational diagram, and that is used to ensure that we are showing all of the necessary entities and individuals on that CMS 855. So we're looking for that organizational chart to follow the line of ownership. This is something that at one point was not being requested during the COVID-19 pandemic. That is something that was a flexibility during the pandemic. That is no longer a flexibility. That is something that MACs are requesting, again, to confirm ownership. Remember, when we're talking about ownership, managing control, we're talking about knowing who has control or access to Medicare funds. So we're really looking at that as a fraud prevention tool. Indirect owners are going to be reported really just like a direct owner. So if you have organizations that have indirect ownership, they're listed in Section 5 as well, as they would be if they were direct. And if you have individuals with indirect, they're being listed in Section 6. When we get more into the roles, we're going to talk about how they're going to designate themselves as an indirect or direct owner. So that is going to be something that is reported on that CMS 855 application and will be developed for if it's something that that organizational diagram determines that is missing from that application. So we will ask about that. One note that I do want to make, and this is for direct and indirect owners, and this is specific to the CMS 855A. It's on the form, but I want to highlight it here. For Part A facilities for CMS 855A applications, in addition to reporting the owners, their roles and their relationship, we are going to also ask about percentages. So we need to know about the percentage of ownership. This is a CMS regulation. They are looking for that information. That's also a common thing that we find is not reported. So when you're filling out those applications, it's just something to be aware of, that we do need that percentage reported. Now we're moving on to more of the managing employee or the manager role, or managing control role. So this is included in ownership because, again, we still have individuals, entities that have day-to-day operational control and have some control over Medicare funds. So they need to be reported. I'm going to start with board members. And for board members, we're looking for any board members that have day-to-day operational control. So typically it's going to be more than, say, just the president of the board or the CEO or the CFO. It's going to be all of them. We're also particularly looking for those officers because, again, they're high-ranking officials. Those officers also tend to be your authorized and delegated official. Not always. Every organizational structure is set up differently, and you'll have to report authorized and delegated officials as designated by your business organization, but that is typically where we find it. And the other question that we often get is, this is a nonprofit, non-staff, non-paid board members. Regardless of that nonprofit status, regardless of those board memberships being paid spots, they do need to be reported because, again, we're looking at who has control, who can make decisions about those Medicare funds that they're receiving. Next, we're going to talk about W-2 managing employees. Now, W-2 is the designation because these types of managing employees are direct employees of the enrolling provider being listed in Section 2. But they also have some type of day-to-day operational control. Some examples of that, it can be an owner, it can be a board member, a director, or an officer. So it can actually be all of the roles that we've just discussed. It can also be a business manager or a credentialing staff member. It can be someone in the business office. So it can be somebody who doesn't necessarily have any type of ownership as well. But in this case, again, it's a W-2 managing employee. So this is an employee that is a direct employee of the enrolling provider listed in Section 2 of the 855. Now, this is also where you will see providers that are in private practice that are filling out the CMS 855I. So maybe you have a sole proprietor or sole owner. They may have a business office staff member that is also acting as a managing employee with day-to-day operational control over that practice, over those funds. A provider in solo practice could be reporting a W-2 managing employee in Section 6. And W-2 managing employees will always be reported in Section 6, regardless of the CMS 855 application that you're completing. That's consistent. There is another type of managing employee that can be reported, and that's contracted employees. And we're looking for contracted employees that have day-to-day operational control. This could be a contracted business management company. This could be potentially someone that's handling the billing, but they're contracted. They're not a direct employee of the enrolling provider. And they're designated typically because they're receiving that 1099 as a tax document at the end of the year versus a W-2. So they're a managing employee, but under contract. They're going to look very much like a W-2 employee, except for whether or not they're directly employed or not. They'll be reported very much the same way. They will have to complete Section 6 of any CMS 855, and this can be in place for an organization, a facility, or someone in private practice. Now, one of the main differences between a W-2 and a contracted employee has to do with their signature rights. So we'll talk about this a little bit more, but with a W-2 employee, they are eligible to be a delegated official. A contracted employee is not unless they have what's known as an additional qualifying role. And we're going to talk about that here in a minute. The other item that does have to be reported, and I've mentioned it a couple of times, are the authorized and delegated officials. These are going to be someone in an ownership role, someone that is a board member, someone who is a W-2 employee or contracted employee with a qualifying role. So authorized officials are going to be somebody that is able to legally bind the entity that is enrolling in a legal contract. They can hold them accountable for following all rules and regulations of Medicare. So they are also going to be the ones responsible for signing initial enrollment applications. They can also sign for changes, they can sign for revalidations, they can sign for any reassignments, additions, terminations, deactivations. Delegated official is somebody that individual, that authorized official, will delegate signatory rights. So a delegated official is not going to be able to sign for an initial enrollment application of an organization, but they could sign for revalidations, they could sign for changes, they could sign for any additions or terminations or deletions or deactivations of reassignments. So once the entity is set up, a delegated official really functions a lot like an authorized official. Again, the biggest difference is a delegated official will sign an initial application, but that's part of them becoming that delegated employee. An initial application, Part A, Part B, 855B, 855A, that has to be signed for the first time by that authorized delegated official, along with any additional signers. So here's that comparison. So I talked about qualifying roles, and the qualifying roles include the owner, direct or indirect. Both are a qualifying role, a director, an officer. Um, They can, as I said, they can enroll that provider, they can do changes, they can do revalidations. They pretty much have carte blanche to do whatever they need to do to that enrollment. W-2, they have to have a qualifying role, which is going to be that W-2, that owner. They can do changes and revalidations, as I said. But W-2, the contracted employees, they can be a delegated official, but they have to have a qualifying role. So going back to that, they have to be an owner, either indirect or owner, indirect or direct. Along with being a contracted employee, they would have to be a director officer along with being a contracted employee. You'll never have a delegated official that has a sole role of contracted employee. That will not be something that the MAC will enroll with signatory rights. Now, every enrollment, every application when it comes in is going to need at a minimum 3 required roles. So the first one is that qualifying role. We've talked about that a lot. Owners, indirect owners, and we're talking about individual qualifying roles here, not necessarily entities. So in section 6 of your applications, we are going to need to have somebody with a qualifying role. If we don't, that is something that we will be developing back to you for. We cannot enroll it. In fact, we cannot get it into the PACO system without someone with that qualifying role. That's a built-in hard-coded edit. We're also going to have at least one managing employee. Now, this does not impact those individuals that are enrolling in private practice on that 855I. If they're in private practice, they are themselves their own managing employee, and the system can recognize that. But when you're looking at the CMS 855B, the CMS 855A, so those group organization and facility enrollments, that is when you're going to definitely need to have someone designated as a managing employee. And then every entity is going to have someone designated as an authorized official that meets the requirements for authorized official. Again, private practice, they act as their own authorized official because in private practice, they're telling us it is all them. They own it, they run it, they control it. It's the groups and the facilities that are going to be designating people to do it. Now, we have to have all 3. I want to be clear, though, that it doesn't mean you have to have 3 different individuals meet these roles. When you're filling out the CMS 855 applications, you'll see the list of roles in the section. You could have the same individual listed with the qualifying role. So let's say you have a direct owner, that's a qualifying role. that direct owner can be the managing employee and the authorized official without designating anyone else as those required roles. If there are other owners, if there are other board members, they all have to be reported, but they don't necessarily have the managing employee or authorized as official. Everybody will have a qualifying role listed. In turn with that, one of the things that we often see is you'll have perhaps a partnership and you have two owners listed. One of them is listed as the managing employee and the authorized official. We've got our qualifying roles and we will enroll that. However, the partner, the second individual with direct ownership, just has the ownership role. They haven't been designated as a managing employee. That's okay. But if they've also not been designated as an authorized official or the optional delegated official, that partner would not have signature rights for that enrollment information. So that's something I want to call out, especially when you're filling out your application as an initial, you want to make sure that you're including designations for everybody with the qualifying roles, who's the manager, and who has signature rights, whether that's authorized or delegated official. Make sure those are designated. That will help you eliminate any issues should someone not be available to sign an application in the future. So before we move on to some examples, I do want to check in with Tom. Do we have any questions in the chat?
We do not have any questions that have not already been answered.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so we'll move on to some examples. So this is our first example, and this is a pretty basic. We're starting with a real simple example. This is pretty typical of your smaller medical clinics. So in this example, we have the enrolling provider. That's the entity that is being listed in Section 2 of your CMS 855B or 855A. Again, these structures are going to be pretty specific to our facilities and organizations and not our providers in private practice, because again, when a provider's in private practice, they are going to be all of those roles for themselves. So in this example, we have 5 direct owners. So on the application, we would expect all 5 direct owners to be reported. Now you can see we have kind of little bodies there. That is indicating that these are direct individual owners. So these are people. So these would be owners that would be reported in Section 6 of your appropriate CMS 855. And to do that, you would need to fill out that section 5 times. If you're doing it electronically, it's super simple. You'll add your first individual's information, and there will be an add button that will allow you to add more information. And you'll just keep going through until all of those individuals have been reported. On a paper application, it's not much more difficult. You're still doing the same process of filling out that CMS 855 section 6. However, you will have to copy and complete that section. And I do want to point out that section 6 has 2 parts. There's 6A and there's 6B. Section 6A is all of the information about the individual owner. So things like their name, their social security number, their date of birth. This is where we're going to ask for that role information. That has to be complete. 6B is adverse legal actions. So that is a yes or no question where you're going to tell us if this individual has any adverse legal actions and then report accordingly if they do and provide documentation. One of the things that we see often is that we'll get multiple Section 6As and one Section 6B, thinking that it'll respond for all 5 individuals in this case, because all 5 individuals have the same answer. Unfortunately, we do need a Section 6A and 6B, both sections, including that yes or no question, for each individual being reported. And if it is missing, it's not something we can take over the phone. It is something that does need to be asked for. Moving on to example 2. So in example 2, we're getting a little bit more complex. Again, at the top, you see that enrolling provider. That's the provider listed in section 2. Next, you're going to see that yellow building. That is going to be a parent organization. That parent organization is the direct owner of the enrolling provider. And these are coming off of actual examples of organizational diagrams that we have received in the provider enrollment area. This is not a copy of it as it came in, but it's a representation of that. So what we're following though is, if you see the line, those are what we're looking for. So we know that that parent organization is the direct owner because there's no ownership structure between the parent and the enrolling provider. So that parent organization is going to be reported in Section 5 of the CMS 855. And again, we're talking about the 855A and the 855B because we're talking about those facilities in this case that are going to have that parent organization. Now that parent organization, there's a third level. And here you have 4 owners listed and a managing employee. They're all individuals. And you'll notice that the owners all say indirect owner. They are an indirect owner of the enrolling provider because they own the parent organization. So this is what that indirect ownership looks like. And so they would need to be reported in Section 6. They've also given us a managing employee who doesn't have ownership, but has operational day-to-day control. That managing employee does need to be reported in Section 6 in addition to the owners. The difference in those sections when they come in is going to be the qualifying roles that are selected. The indirect owners are going to select indirect owner along with if they are also managing employees, which is possible, and if they have any signatory rights, if they're an AO or a DO. The managing employee is going to indicate that they're a managing employee, and if there are any signatory rights. The managing employee would only qualify to be a DO if they're a W-2 employee. The indirect owners, at least one of them is going to have to be the authorized official or that AO. The others, if they meet the qualifications, could be additional AOs. You can report multiple authorized officials, or they could be delegated officials. And again, you can have multiple delegated officials. Also, delegated official is an optional role. You do not have to have it, but oftentimes we find that the authorized officials are the highest ranking officials of the entity, typically a little harder to get rid of, or excuse me, get a hold of. I apologize for that, but it's a little harder to get a hold of them in order to sign an application. So we do recommend, if it fits your business need, to have multiple signers listed. Just makes your life a little easier. Our last example is something we would typically see in the larger organizations that enroll with us. This is not that uncommon for a Part A. In fact, this is coming off of a Part A facility example. So you're going to see the common theme here, enrolling providers at the top. That's the facility that is requesting the PTAM. The next level, you're going to see there's a parent company that has 100% ownership in the entity. With a Part A provider, you're going to need to report that percentage. If it were Part B, you just report them as a direct owner. Then you're going to see that they have 2 management companies. These would be entities that would be reported in Section 5 as having managing control, because here they're not reporting any type of ownership, but they still need to be reported. The next level that you're seeing, we have 2 more entities that own the parent company. They are entities that have indirect ownership in that enrolling provider. Again, if you follow the line, there are direct connections all the way to the enrolling provider. And then there's also an individual with indirect ownership. The entities would also be listed in Section 5, and the indirect owner would be listed in Section 6. Now, those 2 entities have to go another level, and there's really not a limit to the level of ownership. CMS wants to see the entire ownership structure. Anybody who that is in any way, shape, or form going to have access or control over Medicare funds will need to be reported. So here what we have is a situation where we have entities with indirect ownership and they have officers. Those officers of those indirect owners are going to need to be reported in Section 6. So when you're filling out your ownership on a CMS 855 application, that org diagram is also going to help you know who to report. Basically it's all levels of ownership, all direct and indirect, all board members. And this is where for some of the larger organizations, we do understand it can get lengthy, but again, we are asking for this information to protect the Medicare Trust Fund. Before I move into what happens if your ownership changes, I just want to check in one more time with Tom. Do we have any questions in the chat?
We have not had anything added to the chat.
All right, thank you. So changes can happen at any time. And when I was preparing for this session, that was one of the questions that came in on the pre-submitted questions. Questions about how to appropriately report a change in ownership structure. And there's a couple of ways of looking at that, and it really depends on what occurred. So we're going to talk about what those changes look like. I'm going to start with the most common ownership changes that we'll see. There is at its base an organization or an individual that maybe no longer has ownership, or someone has replaced that, or there's an additional organization that we're adding that now has some ownership, or there's an additional individual that needs to be reported. So you'll add new owners, you'll want to remove previous owners. This can impact the direct or the indirect. And as I said, with Part A providers, you are going to have to report that percentage. Now, this type of ownership change, I'm not calling it change of ownership for a reason. A basic ownership change is something that is less than the majority ownership. So we're usually looking for anything less than 50%. You have 10 owners, one of them changes. This is just a regular change application, provided nothing is changed with the legal business name or the tax ID. That happens all the time. We do actually see this a lot during the revalidation process for entities as well. Part of that is making sure the ownership is up to date. So we see a lot of those. If it's outside of that revalidation, though, there is a timeline on it. Ownership is something that does need to be reported within 30 calendar days if there's a change. So if you have that, please do not wait until the revalidation. Certainly, obviously, that's going to be something that has to be reported on that revalidation, but revalidation is every 5 years. So please do not wait. We'll have outdated information on our enrollment records, and these are things that CMS is monitoring for any discrepancies and can actually request the MAC to look into if they find something that doesn't quite line up. The other kinds of ownership changes that can occur, and these are typically involving a 51% or more change in ownership. So if you have one where one entity has been purchased by another organization, and that new organization is going to have ownership transferred to them, and they are taking over the provider's Medicare identification number, that PTAN, or the CMS certification number for Part A, also known as the CCN. If they're taking that over, they're also maintaining that provider agreement. So it's not going to really look any different, except really all of the ownership has changed. And there's typically a bill of sale. There's typically some type of agreement between the seller and the buyer. That is what is referred to as a CHOW, or a change of ownership. But that type of change in ownership, because it is so massive, typically involves two applications. It involves a deactivation from the seller. So those that had ownership of the entity and sold it will be submitting a deactivation. And then an initial application that basically has all of the same information but different owners, that is going to be the buyer application. Um, those are slightly more involved. It is something that we do screen our applications as they come in to identify them. So if there's any documentation that you have, if there's any kind of stock transfer or any type of sale of the business, please include that with your applications so that we can review that to make sure that we have the appropriate information and we're taking it through the appropriate process. That's a little bit different. Another type of change of ownership that's a little bit more involved is an acquisition or a merger. And this is typically where you have two entities that become one. So I shouldn't say that they're not, they can become one. There's a consolidation we'll talk about as well, but where one entity buys another and they're dissolving the initial entity. So the seller's entity is being dissolved. They're not maintaining the PTAN or CCN. They're not maintaining a provider agreement in the event of a Part A provider. And there's going to be a new tax ID. That's really not that dissimilar to the change of ownership we just described. It's just that we're not assuming anything from the previous seller. So it's going to involve two applications, a deactivation for the seller and an initial for the buyer. That's not technically a change, though it's called a change of ownership. The last one is consolidation. So this is where you have two or more entities that are merging and they're coming together to create a new entity. In that case, there's not a buyer or a seller. The previous entities are both going to be dissolved and deactivated. So we'd need two deactivation applications or more, depending on the structure, and then an initial application for the new tax ID that's being created. The reason for going into those is I don't want people to get confused thinking those are the same thing. What I'm talking about here is an ownership change that is relatively minimal. Tax IDs are staying the same. Legal business names probably not changing. We're just changing who is listed in our section 5 and 6. The same types of changes can impact managing control. So this is going to be your business managers, your authorized and delegated officials. It can be your board members. So it can be organizations in section 5 or individuals that are listed in section 6. And we're adding or removing. If we get changes, it's typically because of maybe a name changed or roles have changed, where someone maybe was a board member, but they weren't an authorized official. Maybe they've changed position on that board. We need to know that. And now they're also an authorized official. We need to know that as well. So those are the kinds of changes that we'll see there for that managing control change. It can have that can also happen with owners if we're talking about individuals. Also, much like the ownership change, this does need to be reported in 30 days of the change. Again, we're talking about ownership, managing control, people that have oversight over those Medicare funds. So next I want to talk about, before we get to more questions, I do want to talk about how these changes are going to occur. And I'll start with a paper application. Functionality is different, but the process is essentially the same. So on paper applications, we keep talking about section 5 and 6. In PACOS, the title will be slightly different, but it's the same section. So section 5 is for organizations, section 6 is for individuals. You're going to see in both of those sections some checkboxes at the top. Change, add, and remove. Change is not used very often, and it's generally, there's a name change is probably what we see it most often. If you are changing somebody's role, or if you're changing your authorized official, you're going to want to use the add and the remove checkboxes, because we are required to maintain kind of a history of when this individual was in that role, was an authorized official, and when the next individual came in. So if you're going to change someone, remove someone from a role, you're going to fill out the section on entity from a role. click remove, give us the effective date of that removal. That's going to be the end date for that individual. And in the event they have signatory rights, they're going to be allowed to sign through that date. And if we don't have that date, if we don't do this as a removal, they won't necessarily be listed on the file. That can't accidentally happen though. I can tell you that when these applications are being reviewed, the enrollment staff are looking for that. And if they're seeing it come in as a change instead of that remove of the date, they will ask for that clarification to make sure that we're not causing anyone to be without a signer, because that's another piece of this. There can't be gaps. So then when you go to add the next individual, you'll click add, you'll add them. Pecos applications, as I said, the functionality is really quite similar. There's that add information box that I talked about, but when you're making changes, you're going to want to avoid the edit button. That edit button functions like that change checkbox on paper. That edit button is going to allow you to key over existing data. When that comes into the Macs are looking at that and we're not accepting that. We need an end date. So the appropriate way to make that change to ownership information in Pecos is to delete the individual and add them and add the new individual in. Again, allowing for that history, allowing for, if there are signature rights, as in this example, allowing for those signature rights to still see that be seen in the system. And as you can see here, there's a listing of all of their roles and all of their dates. And that's the information that I'm talking about in the system that we're trying to maintain its integrity. Again, making sure that your organization doesn't have any gaps where they don't have an authorized official, they don't have an owner, they don't have a managing employee. Changes make that really murky. And when you hit the delete, it's not going to immediately remove it. What it's going to do is it's going to give you the image that you see here on the right. It's going to ask you for a termination date, and it doesn't immediately remove it. That has to come through the Mac. We have to review it, we have to approve it, and apply those changes to finalize them in Pecos. So you're not destroying any information by giving us a termination date. You're telling us when we need to make that effective in the system as part of our review. To wrap up, I have provided you with a few resources to help you with that. Ownership reporting is covered in the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, and it is in Title 42 and it's section 424.502. And there is a link here so that you can go directly to that. I'm also providing you with information from the Program Integrity Manual, Chapter 10. Section 10.6.7.1 provides information on organizational owning and managing control information, who to report, what to report. It talks about the qualifying roles we talked about today. It also provides some examples for how to calculate percentages when we're talking about Part A organizations that have to report that. It gives some examples of direct and indirect and what that calculation looks like. Again, that can get a little bit murky, and there's some really good examples there if you care to take a look. Okay, I'm going to check in again with Tom. Do we have any questions in the chat?
All questions have been answered.
Okay. So before we wrap up, I do want to make you aware of some exciting news. CMS is hosting an in-person provider enrollment conference this year. It is being hosted in conjunction with Noridian Healthcare, and the purpose is really to just allow the provider community to get together and provide information. Things that they're going to talk about will include upcoming regulatory changes. There are some provider enrollment 101 sessions that I've seen on that agenda, and you might even see something about PACOS 2.0. We don't have a go live for that yet, but they would be providing some type of an update at this conference if there's one to be provided. So I encourage you to take a look at that. I've included a link there for you. That's a description of the sessions and the agendas for the day, and it's also the registration information. This session is going to be held in August. It's going to be August 28th through and August 29th, and it is being held in San Diego, California. The times of the sessions are going to vary by day, just depends on the session, how long they need for that session. But again, that's all outlined on that link. The other exciting piece of this is a conference that is free to attend. You do have to take care of, obviously, your own travel arrangements and lodging. However, cost to the event, to enter that event, register for that event, there's no fee. So if you want to check that out, you have that information. With that, Tom, I want to check in one more time. Do we have any questions?
I do actually have two.
Okay.
Do changes in ownership reporting that get reported in one PTAN profile get updated in other PTANs under the same tax ID?
Excellent question. That is something that has changed recently, and it does have a lot to do with the upcoming implementation of PACOS 2.0, but also some regulatory changes from CMS. They are, when you update ownership, that is something that is considered to be at the associate level, meaning the associate is the entire entity's universe. So every enrollment record that exists for that PTAN is going to, or that tax ID is going to get updated, which also means all PTANs under that tax ID are going to have that ownership information updated. The intent of that is it's one tax ID, the ownership should be the same. Now, when we're talking owners, the managing employees could be different, but the owners are those that are in ownership of that entity. And the idea is also with PACOS 2.0, it's going to simplify that process for you. You won't have to send in, if you have 15 different enrollments, 15 different applications. Information will be updated. Excellent question.
All right, well, your next question actually leads from the previous one because you did mention this real briefly, but what updates made for changes to what about updates made for changes for managing employees? Do these changes get auto updated to all PTANs under the same tax ID?
Yep, depends on those roles. And if there's, say, a W-2 managing employee, that is something that could be different per PTAN. So that's not something that's going to get changed. Now, if that managing employee, or if that managing employee is also an owner and an authorized official, the ownership would get updated. The authorized official information is generally going to carry over, but delegated official information is something that can be specific to those PTANs. So it's really about that highest level of ownership and control that CMS is updating across the board.
All right, next question, same question, but based on board members.
Same thing there. The board member is going to be that rank, so they're going to be looking at that. Again, it's based on the tax ID. Oops, sorry. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. I was just going to move on to the next question. Let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready.
Okay. How do you confirm that all PTANs have been updated based on the update of one PTAN under the same tax ID?
The best place to do that for yourself, rather than if you're submitting electronically, go into PACOS and go in. Once you sign in, you'll see the My Associates button, and that's going to allow you to get into all of the enrollments that you have connections for. And so if you've been submitting electronically, you go into the enrollment, you'll see all of the PTANs under that enrollment, and it will show the ownership information. You'll navigate, it'll allow you to view the record, and you'll be able to navigate to that ownership and managing control section from that view.